To be, to become, to begin, where the river leans to the sea. To learn, to let go, to love. The world turns endless, turning me. Oh.
Your attention is the cursor of your consciousness, but right now that cursor is being hijacked by a multi-billion-dollar vacuum. Today, Jim and I talk about the new Goebbels, how AI therapy apps could become the ultimate tools for indoctrination, and why the war on Game B is actually a war for your ability to be bored, to think, and to feel for yourself. Enjoy.
So you said that this time we will dive into feeling, not the preferred scope of discussion for Jim, because you say you don't have those, and I strongly disagree.
Yeah, I don't have feelings at all. In fact, we can talk about that. We can start there.
But I have a framing actually for this that you're familiar with, because it was very fresh about 4 years ago. 4 years and a couple of weeks ago, you and I had a conversation as I was returning from my mother, who was dying at the time. And I had asked her about deep insights in her life. And she told me that with her fading body, she could feel her mind and her soul fade. And I asked her, "What's the soul for you?" And she responded, "The soul is for feeling what the mind is for thought." And when I shared that story with you, you said that's something Damasio would say, probably. And if we layer on top of that the ideas of Kahneman, of thinking fast and slow, system 1 and 2, and essentially we could say that if Kahneman is right, and 90% or more of your decision making comes from heuristics, which are expressed as feelings, then what we need to do in order to move into this new beautiful world that we want to move into, Game B, call it whatever, then the work to be done is a soul shift, right? A change in feeling. But the feeling are just
one of the big pieces, for sure. Not the only piece.
That's probably a big piece, because if our heuristics are matched towards Game A, so we're tending to on autopilot play Game A kind of games because we are constructed that way, but those heuristics seldom are accessible to us, right? They're in system 1, they're quite subconscious to us usually. The interesting discussion then is how can we access those heuristics? How can we decide which heuristics are relevant? How can we rewrite them actively such that we can move into a kind of life we desire? And I want to anchor this now in your thoughts about your personal heuristics. So what are some of the heuristics that you know of that you might like or dislike, some that you have actively rewritten, and some that you've put in or deleted, so that you were able to become the Jim that you are today, but in an active loop process.
To the degree I can have any insight into that, I'll try. But before I hop in, I'm going to mention a book I just recently read. Let me see if I can get the title. By Lisa Feldman Barrett. And it is Lisa Barrett. And her argument, and I will say I'm not 100% sure how emotions are made is the name of the book. I think she may slightly overclaim when she claims that all emotions are socially constructed. And I think the evidence is that there may be a few strong, deeply biological emotions like fear and anger, and maybe a couple others. But I do think that in general, our emotions or feelings, and the distinction between the two is interesting. I like to use the distinction, which she does not, that the emotions are the physiological aspects, right? You know, increased heart rate, flows of adrenaline, sweat, etc. That the feelings are the cognitive interpretations of those, right? And so that there is, in Damasio's term, the emotions are likely modulated down in the brain stem, but the higher brain is connected to the brain stem and to the midbrain, and that the cascade of physiological change then gets transduced into cognitive change. And so I think that in that model, it's quite hopeful that we can actually reprogram our feelings by interpreting our physiological responses in a different way. And talk about that fair bit in the personal institutional spiral in the Game B work, that the personal is in part reprogramming those feelings. And it's not easy, right? Because as you point out, we have been raised in a Game A context, a Game A social context, Game A educational system, a Game A system of status. And so we have a whole bunch of, transducers that, turn a signal of X into say a feeling of failure, right? When it could be a feeling of learning, or just as easily, right? Something that you did and it didn't work. I've been lucky in that regard. I guess I don't know why, but I've always considered failure to be learning. I failed lots of times, and it's never bothered me, right? At least since I was 16, when I figured that out, and that error is learning, unless it's egregiously stupid. And I try to avoid the egregiously stupid, but if you try something sensible and it fails, it's a learning opportunity. So I was never afraid to fail. I noticed that is quite different than most people, and that if we could somehow socialize that idea alone, that would be quite useful. But anyway, the bigger question, or the bigger picture, is if Barrett's more or less right, and I think she is, for let's say particularly higher level complex emotions of the sorts that animals don't have, like embarrassment or shame or bad self-regard or ecstasis, on the positive side. The mystical. I doubt animals have mystical experiences. Those kinds of feelings and emotions probably very likely socially constructed, which means they're amenable over time to adjustment towards the Game B direction. And that as we think about our cords within our membranes, part of and the currents that we're setting up in our membranes, part of that ought to be, in an omni-considerate fashion, how are we helping people move towards more pro-social versions of feelings that come from the physiological signals as we go through our lives. So I do think that is is important, and it's also important in this. In fact, that's one of the next essays I'm writing is that we have to also consider the considerable range of human variability. An example I like to use, because it's well supported by research, is the Big Five personality model. It's not perfect, of course. It's an arbitrary chopping up of signals, and basically the ocean model: openness versus closedness to new experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, introversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And there is considerable range across humans in all five of those. You may be able to move them some socially, but it's thought that a fair bit of it's genetic. And so whatever systems we create, what institutions we create, and what accords we have, and what society we have. We got to keep in mind that people are going to be different places on those continuums, and so that what works for one kind of person won't necessarily work for another. To ground it personally, I've actually taken the ocean ice both times with professional people and gotten the same answer both times. I am extremely anti-neurotic, like the 100th percentile, and that provides me a substantial, I don't know what, superpower against, game A trying to, tame me or something. I really just don't give a fuck game A things, right? Never have. And even when I was playing it hard, I am very super resilient to criticism, or I really don't give a fuck what people think, things like that. But that's just a lucky roll of dice, probably a combination of genetics and my family. My parents were that way to a substantial degree. But there are lots of people, and seemingly more every day, who are over in the neurotic spectrum. And so we have to understand how to build ways of life that work for people that are higher in neuroticism, while we may be able to reduce overall neuroticism by having a better culture. I suspect it doesn't shift it all that much.
So one way of rewriting those heuristics, and I want to really try to anchor it in first-hand experience that you've had, at least in the beginning, so that we can then maybe extrapolate from there. And I'm also happy to share some of my own rewritings, but let's begin in yours. So the most reliable way to rewrite heuristics is, you mentioned learning, is repetition, right? If you have a car that's manual, you have to do that a couple of times, or many times, many hundreds of times. You practice until it becomes part of you and you never have to think about it again, right? There's a signal, visual, auditory signal coming from that car that gives you the indication, maybe even vibration, that gives you the indication you have to shift the gear, and you do it and you don't even think about it. And same for learning how to walk, all of that. Now, you have read Lord of the Rings how many times?
Just finished my 39th reading.
All right, so you have a fair bit of repetition on that. What heuristics has that exercise that you started very early, right? 14 or 12, or when did you?
14 or 15. I was in 10th grade at the time, so it was 14 or 15.
So what kind of heuristics would you guess has Lord of the Rings implanted in you that has shaped you differently than it would have what that has shaped the outcome, Jim, today, such that this was is a direct correlation?
That's an interesting question. I think it has certainly reinforced courage, right? Because think of Frodo walking into Mordor, a seemingly hopeless thing, but he does it anyway, right? There are many examples throughout the book of people taking on missions that seem relatively low probability. Think of Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas going to rescue Merry and Pippin, right? And that's a very interesting example, because they fail actually, but because they're acting courageously, 3 guys against a couple of hundred orcs, in theory, could have happened. A cascade of good things unanticipated occurred. So I think there's an example, and that it also warns, I think, substantially against treason, right? That the blight is always with us. There are always people who we think are on our side, but are actually subverting what we're doing. Saruman, the most powerful wizard, turns out to have actually been captured by Sauron. And one of my deep beliefs is that, kumbaya, utopianism is very dangerous because it doesn't realize there are bad people out there. There will always be 1 or 2% sociopaths, and those people are always going to be trying to subvert the system. And there's also weak people who just want to steal, and that any system that's going to be good has got to know how to not tolerate the bad people. The bad people actually do exist, and they can't all be made good people. Sorry, right? I think that's something I very much learned. And also honor. The classic example of Rohan honoring their alliance with Gondor, even though they didn't have to, and they were, they took a big risk doing so. They got their ass saved by the Ents, but they nonetheless knew the fact that they were taking a huge risk, and came to Gondor's aid and bought enough time for other things to happen. Let's see what else.
So you clearly live in that world. Have you? I know the moment in 90 something where you had this epiphany about the way game A is fucked up and is fucking us up. And it's I imagine that this insight was a fully embodied felt sense that something is off, right? And it's like the moment you learn how to read it's a very distinct moment where you start putting lines into meaning or to transferring meaning into lines, and it's a fully embodied insight. Can you remember that level of insight attached to the readings? So if you're like 15 and you're sitting on a bus and you're reading, and then you suddenly some of these moments that you were just discussing from the book leaked into your life and gave you a different perspective that was so deep that you had a fresh insight that now started directing your life?
I don't know if there was anything quite like an epiphany. I think Lord of the Rings was more of a gradual absorption of various perspectives. I'm sure it improved my appreciation for nature and, a relatively simple way of living, and such. I don't recall any huge epiphany from the Lord of the Rings. And nor do I specifically remember it being related to my 1994 epiphany that game A was fun. Don't see a direct relationship between the two. Yeah, no, the actuator of that was a online community on the Well called Sustainability that had some people far more advanced in thinking about the challenges of sustainability than I. And in my conversations with them, and also had the advantage of being in the belly of the beast at the time. I was more or less chief technology officer for an $8 billion corporation that owned all kinds of media properties. And so the double combination, none of them had that experience, but I didn't have their knowledge and maturity on the sustainability issues. It suddenly came to me that the sustainability issue was tied up with the institutional structure of the economy and particularly the media sphere, in particularly advertising. And that the combination of I didn't have the words yet of, the system optimized for money on money return, but I was feeling my way towards that. And that advertising and the media structure was a very powerful accelerator and a culturator in programs, the heuristics that you were talking about, towards continuing to drive us insanely towards unsustainable practices. By 1994, it was pretty clear to me that the road we were on was literally non-sustainable. And why would we do that, right? And then the insight that advertising and related cultural programming was forcing us that way. So that was the essence, I think, of that 1994 epiphany. And that felt like an epiphany. Like, here I was, head down business dude, probably a little bit less psychopathic than most, but suddenly with the exposure to the sustainability community, pieces clicked, and I said, "This is fun."
What I would try to find out is, apart from the 1 percentile non-possibility of becoming psychotic for you, is the question of what other ingredients enabled you to be in that position, to see what you saw, right? Because I would say there were other people in similar positions seeing the emergence of sustainability even within the space of their business endeavors. So that's these two forces were present for many people, but not many people actually started integrating them. So I'm looking for the underlying elements that enabled you to do that, to see that.
Yeah, I can tell you, as I think about comparisons of myself and my contemporaries, the ones that I know at least, and I did know all the tech lords of the 90s, Scott McNealy and Gates, Larry Ellison, had, Steve Ballmer, I spent a couple hours with each of them at various times. And I think the biggest difference, and also my contemporaries at Thomson, where I was the CTO-ish, and they were very good people, very ethical in the main, a few exceptions, smart, hardworking. But all these people, with the possible exception of Gates to some degree, were completely invested in playing the game A game. That's who they were. Right? And I always took the game A game, well, I played it seriously and hard, relatively lightly. And some of that came from the fact that I'd fucked around for several years after I graduated from college, right? I didn't go on a single interview my senior year. I did not talk to a single recruiter. I was a reader of the beats, Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg and people like that. Game beat adjacent like William Burroughs, Henry Miller. I was a classic disillusioned youth who had the idea of going to work for Digital Equipment Corporation or IBM or Raytheon, which were Xerox, which there weren't startups in 1975, or very few. They were hard to find. No person from a good university would go to one as their first job. And so the idea of going to work for, one of these big tech conglomerates, like, fuck that, no interest in that at all. So I went back to my hometown and just took a bullshit job as a car salesman and partied for a year, hardcore. It was fun. 1976, that was a good time to party, let me tell you. And then of course, actually, as soon as I got home in 75, having read all the On the Road and all that stuff, I took off on a 2-month hitchhiking tour around the country, where I hitchhiked from Maryland on the East Coast to the West Coast, up to Seattle, all the way down the coast along the 2-lane coastal highway to San Diego, and then across, visited people I knew in Tucson and Austin, and then on to New Orleans for a couple of days, and up to Boston to hang out with some of my college buddies, and then home. And after that, I got a job as a college textbook salesman, which was, once you learned how to do it, was a kind of light lifting job. And you just went around talking to professors every day, about 10 or 15 of them, and talked about, at least my technique was talk about what they were interested in. And then at the end say, we got some books that you might be interested in, blah, blah, blah. And once you got good at it, it was about, a third of a time job. And I spent the rest of my time just working on various ideas and things, none of which actually panned out. But I was just sort of taking it easy. And there was a career path within college textbook publishing, which I was clearly on. I could become an editor, blah, blah, make a decent living, nothing spectacular. And so I think that 5 years, basically, of not taking game A particularly seriously, kind of immunized me against becoming overly indexed on it. And
what exactly about that time was it that's immunized you?
That's a good question. that I didn't care about money. By that point, who's now my wife, was my girlfriend. By the middle of that, we were living together, and neither of us were interested in fancy stuff. Lived in a pretty basic 2-bedroom apartment, and my office was in one. My pile of college textbooks to hand out to professors. So we were never interested in money or that kind of thing, or status through possessions. I think 5 years of that kind of established that as a leitmotif of life, essentially, and that the life of the mind was always important to me. The fact that I intentionally took light lifting jobs so that I could think. And even when I was game A motherfucker, I was still reading 75 books a year and thinking about things that were outside of being a game A motherfucker. So I suspect those are some of the things that help. And I did a second long trip for almost a year in '76. That was also very interesting. And I went out to California, and then I ended up spending like 8 months in Idaho, ski resort town. And again, I worked at a Circle K convenience store as the night shift manager, right? Very light lifting in some sense. And, so I think those not feeling the crushing need to play the game and climb the ladder was a very good immunization of not falling too far into the game.
Okay. By the way, if you were in La Jolla in '76, we might have bumped into each other because I was born in La Jolla in '75. So who knows?
That's interesting. Yeah, I went right by La Jolla in '75. I did not.
I see.
My '76 trip, I went straight to San Francisco. And, I did not go down that way. But yes, my '75 trip, I went right down Highway 1, all the way from Seattle to San Diego.
Okay. Okay.
You're an American citizen. I didn't realize
that. Yes.
You could run for president. You should do
it. I have to live there for a number of years to run for president. So not anymore.
Oh, do you?
It used to be the case.
I think there is. Yeah, there is some requirement for that.
There is some requirement like that. So you mentioned time to think. So where does that come from? Where did you pick up that it's necessary to think, and what is thinking even? So that seemed to be a very central thing here.
I think that is important. And I was always a thinker. By the time I was a very little kid, I would ask annoying questions in school. I still remember in second grade asking the teacher, "Is your sense of the color blue the same as my sense of the color blue?" Right? And I was very fortunate when I was in third grade, so about 8 years old, 7 years old probably. My best friend, who became my best friend, the kid had relocated from elsewhere, and somehow he and I connected. And he was a thinker and from a family of thinkers, which is kind of unusual in the working class community where I grew up. He and I would just talk about the craziest shit, and his older brothers were also thinkers. We'd talk about all kinds of things, and so I think I developed a taste for that from a pretty, I think I had an inclination towards it from an early age, and that experience actually helped a lot. Hey, Harvey, if you're out there, right, my buddy, and such. So yeah, and I always read a shitload, from the time I was 6. It was fun, 5, even 5, probably, certainly 6. One of the things that was annoying was our elementary school class would go to the library once a week and pick out a book. But if we went as a class, we had to select books from these kids' shelves, which were like stupid ass Dr. Seuss books and stuff. And I go, I want to read the science books, goddamn. Oh no, you can't check those out. You're too young. So, but I discovered by trial and error that if I went to the library on the way out of school at the end of the day on the way to the school bus, they didn't give a shit. So I started loading up on astronomy, chemistry, stuff like that, geology, zoology, so I could check out real books. And I read a bunch of those from the time I was 5, 6, 7, 5 and 6. And so I developed, strong interest in trying to figure out the world by reading about it and thinking about it. And so I think that has always been a pattern. And a fair bit of my time fucking off for 5 years was reading. Right? I still remember. I guess it was the summer of '78. Summertime as a college textbook salesman, you were almost entirely off work, which was great. You make a couple of visits to campus, but not much. I spent a month reading E.O. Wilson's sociobiology very carefully and working through the examples and trying to find holes in his logic and everything else, sitting by the swimming pool in our little apartment complex. And, I just thought that was the highest use of my time, the most fun thing I could do, reading this 800-page thick, somewhat mathematical tome about sociobiology. That one. So I've always had a taste for that stuff. And in my business career, I also made sure I made time to keep my reading up at about 75 books a year. And then even when I was at the very top of my game as CEO of Network Solutions, and it was true also as CTO of Thomson, that I instructed my assistant to keep a 2-hour block every day for thinking. It was labeled thinking. And now sometimes, of course, in the crunch of a crisis, I'd have to burn that time to solve some goddamn problem that some other person didn't solve because it wasn't supposed to get to my desk. But sometimes they did. But probably at least 3 days out of 5, I was able to spend 2 hours just thinking. Now, I spent a lot of that time thinking about business issues, but I spent some of that time thinking about God knows what. So I guess the fact that I've always considered thinking about stuff core to who I am is what has allowed me probably to do a lot more thinking than most people.
Before we go into what thinking actually is, I want to take a little detour further down into when you were 5-ish, probably. Because what you're describing in terms of curiosity and asking relentless questions, I think that's something that's natural to human beings in general, but it gets shut down very quickly in most environments. And it seems that you mentioned that story about the school teachers not being very supportive, but it seems that there has been some support, or you were incredibly stubbornly attached to your curiosity from a very early age to going through any wall that was in your way. So which was it, or was it a mixture? Do you recollect anything that has supported your curiosity as a child?
Yeah, certainly for the first few years, say up through 3rd grade, so that would be 7-ish. If anything, the institutions and the teachers were an obstruction. I just busted through them. We had a bookmobile that would come to our town every 2 weeks, which was basically a bus that was turned into a small library that was part of the library system. And that was another one of my exploits. They didn't give a shit. You could take anything you want. I'd carry 6 big old fat books home and read them. And I still recall that some of my friends in the neighborhood would spend their spare cash on comic books, and I was like, "Fuck comic books!" I would buy these little 50-cent Who, What, and Where science books with my spare change. In those days, a comic book cost 12.5 cents. You got 2 for 25. So while they got 4 comic books, I got one kind of popular science book on some topic I was interested in. So I'd say the first 3 years of, say, elementary school, just brute force, didn't give a fuck, as you say, just overcame the obstacles to do what I wanted to do. And then I was lucky. I had good teachers from that point on in K-12 education who encouraged my interests. And one in particular, fourth grade teacher, kind of took me in hand, and she, the one that introduced me to fiction. Up until then, I absolutely refused to read fiction, saying, why would I waste my time on false stuff, right? And she turned me on to science fiction, and that led me to a greater interest in other kinds of fiction. And so that was pretty significant. And fifth grade teacher did the same, and the sixth grade teacher. And then very, very lucky to have had excellent teachers from that point forward in K-12 education, at least, who were supportive of sort of a young radical who did things a little differently. And my parents, too, I will say. They didn't quite know exactly what to make of me, but particularly my mother was very supportive of the road I was on, even though it was quite different than theirs. Neither of them were educated folks. My father dropped out of high school after ninth grade to support his family. My mother left home when she was 14. So these were not fancy folks, but they were people of very good values, and they more or less respected the somewhat eccentric road that I was on, which was important, right? And if we think about, Game B institutions, families that support children in their real interests is going to be an important part, not the ones that say, don't do that, you have to be more conventional, right? You have to go out and try out for the football team. Turns out the kid is more interested in reading books than he is in the football team, even though he's a pretty good football player. Then you should support that.
But you turn out differently from your brothers, right? Your brothers. So how's that possible? Where does that difference come from?
Well, the easiest one is my closest brother in age, 2 years younger than I. Similar in intelligence, similar in forcefulness, but he suffered from very severe dyslexia. It was extremely hard for him to read, to deal with schoolwork, etc. And so he didn't do well in school. Though fortunately, our high school had a system where you could take a minimal number of courses and then work half the day. And so he got into the work study program, and he turned out to be, if you got to know him, he would be very successful in work. And so, he claims to have never read a book in his life, and I think that might be true. He did somehow get a 4-year college degree from a relatively okay college, through having his girlfriends read his books and explain them to him and things like that. And then he built starting from absolutely nothing, literally picking up trash with a stick with a nail on the end of it. You can track his career to a big and successful construction company that, at its peak was doing $50 million a year of construction business. And he did extremely well. And so, but, the fork in the road, read 5,000 books, read 0 books, is going to take you different places.
What does he think about your Game B stuff?
I don't think I've ever even talked to him about it.
That would be so interesting. Okay.
He knows I'm working on it. He just rolls his eyes. We don't even talk about that stuff much. We talk constantly. We're good friends. Constantly on the phone, a couple times a week. Visit regularly. In fact, he's going to drive me to one of my things this week. So that's just very different. Even though we grew up in the same household, but we both developed the sense of doing it our way and being forceful and intelligent, which allowed us to do that.
Okay.
And then the other brother, much younger, he was 9 years younger, and and he was also highly intelligent and highly forceful, and amongst the most fearless people I've ever met in my life. I'm pretty fearless, but he goes to another level. And he adopted my father's model. My father had been in the Marines in the U.S. Marine Corps in World War II, and then had become a cop. And so the youngest brother joined the Marines when he was 17, and after he got out of the Marines, he became a federal law enforcement guy and rose in the ranks to very high rank. He could have been the head of the whole agency if he wanted to, but he turned the job down. And he was a cop's cop, basically, and very successful at it. And then retired after 33 years, and now, of course, is a consultant to people trying to sell shit to law enforcement, doing well at that. So, all three of us were quite similar in our personalities and our horsepower, and we just happened to take different roads.
Yeah, that's what I'm curious about, because it's serendipity where you come from, but it's the interesting question is what are some stable factors that could be replicated, right?
I think our family was a stable factor for sure.
Sorry, yep.
Very good family to have come from.
Yeah. So, I mean, we part of the game B movement is somebody who has had an upbringing very much focused on what you were describing and empowering children to explore whatever they needed and wanted to explore. Daniel Schmachtenberger, he basically grew up outside of the school system with a lot of support by his family, and there aren't many brighter brains on the planet than his, I would guess, right? So he could be a good example in this discussion for this kind of upbringing. But I want to bring it to
scale.
Maybe it does.
That will scale. He had his parents. I know his father was a college professor. I don't know what his mother did, but yeah, and embedded in a very alternative community. So the question is, how do you scale those kinds of experiences so that a large percentage of people can have a supportive family, but one that say in my own case, honored things like conscientiousness and courage and not giving a fuck what other people thought and such. So that's part of the thinking through what are the currents inside a game B membrane that help develop children to be able to not feel like they're steered to a conventional approach, but decide what approach they want to take in their life and lead it with the support, assuming it's not a totally aberrant one, though I'm sure my parents thought my fucking around for 5 years was pretty aberrant, but they never criticized me for it, I will say. They somehow knew that I would come out the other side, probably knew it more than I did. And so that kind of parenting, and the Schmachtenbergerian kind, more radical, but I think that you could do that in the game B world too, where instead of school, there's education in the community. I strongly believe that putting kids in chairs for 6 hours a day to work drills is not a good use of kids' time. Fortunately, in my day, they did a lot less of that. But where we got with this testing-based education in the United States and rigorous, you have to learn all these little micro things. What you really need to know is learn how to learn, right? Learn what the patterns are of reality. I would also strongly believe that learning artisanal skills is hugely important. If I were designing an educational system, I would have every kid from the age of 6 or 7 try various artisanal things and then choose one about the age of 10, 11 maybe, and then really become a serious practitioner of some trade, some artisanal hands-on thing, shoemaker, woodworker, metalworker, chef, seamstress, designer, and I do think that that's one of the where we really fall down with our kids is not teaching them the artisanal tradition. And I was lucky in that regard, in that in my hometown, nobody ever hired a carpenter or a plumber or anything like that. You just did it yourself. And there were enough people in, my neighborhood was, mostly upper working class folks like plumbers, electricians, carpenters, folks like that. And so even my relatively incompetent, but incompetent mechanical father was able to learn from his peers, and I was always with them, so I learned too. How to replace a water line on a sink, how to change the motor in a washing machine. My father and I actually swapped out the motor in our Volkswagen one time ourselves. Right? I will say I did the thinking, and I was about 11 at the time, but we managed to get it done. And so those we laid concrete. We busted up old broken driveways and laid fresh concrete. Built a big patio around the house. Did it all ourselves. And so, those kinds of, though it wasn't necessarily deep in any one artisanal skill, I got exposed. My father and I finished our basement together, right? And I was probably 12 at the time, and I did the design and the math and what have you, and what cuts to make, etc. But so I had lots of different artisanal experiences. I wish I'd had one in depth. I even laid a brick wall one time, a small one. But, so having had numerous artisanal light exposures, I think was quite good. And I wish I'd had one deep one where I'd really become good at one of the artisanal skills.
Yeah, it's amazing how.
But now I think back, having that multitude of artisanal experiences was probably I never thought of that before. It's probably quite helpful in having the worldview that I do.
In what sense? What does that do for you in the worldview?
It makes the world deeper, right? Because it's really easy to assume that if you live in Game A, particularly if you're middle class or above, that you're just interacting with a surface. You have a problem with your toilet, you call the plumber. Your food comes from the grocery store. Meat comes on little plastic trays, right? Everything is surface and button pressing. Well, if you have these artisanal experiences, particularly in managing your own life, you realize that the world's a bit deeper, and that you can influence the world, and you can have impact in physical ways, for sure. And I think that one of the biggest problems of Game A is giving us this smooth push button access to the underlying provisioning. And I'd say, think about where we are today, where you can, order your dinner on Grubhub or something and have it delivered, right? Such things did not exist when I was a kid, needless to say. And we went out to restaurants relatively infrequently, maybe 3 or 4 times a year, something like that. But I know there are people who order from one of these, DoorDash or Uber Eats or something every day almost, right? And talk about superficial, in terms of your relationship with provisioning. You pull up an app, cheeseburger, fries, milkshake, ding, done, right? You don't even have to go out and get it. You don't have to interact with anybody. And the person leaves it at your door, right? So I think that this alienation from the substrate of life is part of the alienation that we feel from Game A.
And it deepens your thinking, right? Because, like you say, because once you step through the abstractions of the convenience of money, of all of the service layers, you have to start thinking about how do you actually achieve the goal in the physical world you want to achieve. We mentioned thinking several times in your descriptions around fixing things in the real world with your father, right? So using thinking as a bridge between the abstract and the theoretical and the practical physical. And then in that, what would you say is thinking?
Well, thinking gets multiple things. So I should also add one other thing. I hadn't really thought about this. Good conversation today. In 1989, my wife and I bought a hillbilly farm in Appalachia. It had been a failed hippie commune, and before that, it had been in the same family for 225 years. And it was, a bit of a dump. It had a homemade bathroom with a rusty old tub and a garden hose for a shower and things of that sort. But we loved it, and at the time, I got into doing a lot of stuff myself. There was an old beat up tractor which I restored. There was the fields were in terrible shape, so I got those back into good shape, and et cetera. Did a lot of just basically improving the place over time, and so that also added to. And this was again, by 92, I was back into the fast track again after taking a break between another venture. I got back into the corporate world now too. And people would always say, well, why the hell do you go down to spend all your time on the weekends at this farm? I go, at the farm, there isn't much I can't fix with a sledgehammer. And if you don't get out of my face, I'm going to try that out on you. Right? And so it was, again, another example of grounded in reality. So back to the question of what is thinking. I also do a lot of truly abstract thinking, right? What is the nature of emergence? What is the difference between, how do we think about the intricate interbraiding of causality and emergence? And, what is the nature of, why does evolutionary computing, which is kind of my home academic field, work? But why is it such a weak method, right? And when you use it rather than some other method, to what degree are the solutions different? So I'm very abstracted. The work up in the California Institute for Machine Consciousness has pulled me back in deep abstract thinking mode. But I've also, recently, a couple of years ago, designed my own office at our farm, and we had a standalone. Now that my grandkids are taking over my office in the house and turned into their bedroom, I needed a new office, so I designed one. I had it built, and that required some thinking. What did I need? What did I not need? Very important. Big decision I made was no bathroom. It just adds to complexity of the thing. I can piss off my little porch, which I had built instead. If I need to take a dump, I'll go in the house, only 35 feet away. So thinking through the problem in some detail and some nuance and richness in the material, where the material and ideas come together. And then, of course, the Game B work, I think a whole bunch about the intersection between the personal and the institutional, and that those two are intimately interwoven. And that's really the most interesting problem of all, in some sense, because it's very high dimensional. You can't come to any final answers. All you can do is come up with some interesting heuristics and ways of approaching the overall problem. So, I like thinking. I just like thinking in lots of ways, and I'm fairly good at it in many ways. I know in business, that was one of my superpowers, man. If you wanted a strategy cooked up to fuck over your opponent, you did not want me off. You were in a fucking world of hurt, right? And got really, really good at hardcore strategy, and particularly because the strategy is going to always be implementable. And I suppose that may have come from my grounding in all the artisanal stuff, that if I propose a strategy, it can be executed. And or at least I think it can be. Sometimes it fails, but I strongly condition strategy on practicality.
Okay, so thinking kind of like as a bridge between the theoretical, intellectual, and the practical. But what is it? What is thinking? What's your definition?
Well, from a cognitive science perspective, which we can start there and see how far we can go.
Okay.
I think what differentiates thinking in humans from cognition in higher animals is principally that we have language and we have words. And words can become conscious contents and can become parts of our memories, and that thinking is literal thinking of the thinking it through variety, as opposed to just using a heuristic. is the manipulation of words in working memory and in your cognitive frame to go from one word to another, essentially, using the intention mechanism that our consciousness provides. And I often refer to consciousness, attention, as the cursor of consciousness. You are your attention, essentially. Every quarter of a second or thereabouts, your brain makes a decision whether to continue to pay attention to what you're currently paying attention to or to switch to something else. And to approximately the first order, you can only pay attention to exactly one thing at a time. It's not exactly true, but close enough for most purposes. So the jumping of attention from thing to thing to thing in a way that is constrained by a goal. We do believe that there are other factors in the frontal lobe in particular where we establish our goals. And that's part of the thing that votes on what's the next thing in attention. To the degree that you have a relatively clear goal for a while, that forces your attention into a particular chain of chasing words and other images and feelings and memories and things like that. And so it's the ability to orchestrate that internal cursor of attention with respect to either a goal or an open-ended search, which is what thinking actually is.
In the open-ended search, or
sometimes I do a lot of that, just kind of daydreaming or just especially when I'm like driving. I'll have an idea of something I'm kind of interested in, and rather having a goal, I'll just let the cursor of attention do its thing in an open-ended way in kind of a domain, right? Probably some of my best thinking comes from that.
Does your thinking always happen in words, or is it also in other modalities? Is it pictures or sounds or a mixture of? Is there a hierarchy of these?
Now, I do, from what I have read, is that people differ in their style of thought. Einstein famously said he did not think in words; he thought in geometry. And other people I know, artists, say they think in images. I tend to think in words. I'm a very wordy guy, right? In both senses of the word. And so I think I know I do have occasional geometric insights and occasional image insights, but I would say, I'm on the continuum fairly far over on thinking in words. Actually, here's hugely important. And one of the things that makes my thinking probably more generative than some other folks is that words can be attached to greater or lesser hierarchical complexity, right? For instance, when I talked to my brother, I talked about the construction guy, about complicated versus complex. He would think they're the same thing, more or less, right? And while when I hear the word complex in particular, I have this huge tree of 40 years of knowledge of complexity science, which becomes tagged with the word complex when I use it. And so when I use complex, it has tremendous hierarchical complexity. And the distinction between complex and complicated can be quite clear and very important. While for most people, they're similar or just a slight difference in flavor. And because I've read so much, thought so much, talked to so many intelligent people over the years, I probably have way deeper hierarchical complexity on many of my words. And so when I'm shuffling these words around through this cursor of attention, it's activating a whole bunch of depth beneath those words that have hierarchical complexity. And that probably caused the cursor of attention to operate in a different fashion.
Would you say this depth is stored in heuristics? So do you have to think the entire tree of complexity that you've accumulated over 40 years in words every time, or are some aspects, some dimensions of that stored in heuristics and presented more as a feeling than words first, and then maybe translated into words?
I don't unravel hierarchical complexity at all in
Mm.
most cases. But
I
I
would have been
suspect that
surprised.
a fair bit of that would be worthless. You'd be down the rabbit hole all the time. The I do believe that at least part of the tree is activated when you say the word, right? So
Mhm.
that those episodic memories and declarative memories that are associated with that tree start to ping a little louder, quite a bit louder, probably in the vote for what the next thing in attention is going to be. Because that's the
Mhm.
other part of my theory of thinking is that the currently activated memories that you have from your whole life, probably weighted more towards recent ones, but not necessarily, uh, are involved in voting, quote unquote, in some obscure sense, the mechanism which I don't understand at all, towards what's the next object in attention. And some of the things
Mm.
that activate memories has similar objects, right? So if a vicious dog suddenly appears, then memories in which you encountered a vicious dog are activated. If you say the word complexity, at least some things, and depending on the context, probably, um, and also the other things that are in your conscious frame at the moment, those things will be activated, and they will have increased votes on what you think, what word comes next, or what jump comes
Mm.
next in your attention. And then, very importantly, and this has implications for mental health, I believe, both mental health and superior thinking, is that memories that have high emotional valence, either positive or negative, are more or have stronger votes. So
Mhm.
really positive, the memories that have very positive emotional valences get a bigger vote, and the um, memories that have negative valences get a bigger vote. And indeed, one of the advantages of being an optimist, if you're tuned at least sort of correctly, is that you get more positive things voting than negative things voting. And as a moderate optimist, I suspect that's always been helpful. And my normal mental state is like a +2 or +3 out of 10. Right? If I just, I'm in a completely neutral zone. Neutral for me is +2 or +3. Well, for other people I
Mhm.
know, neutral -2 or -3.
Mhm.
That would kind of suck. And so, you know, uh, and I think that's a fair bit related to the neuroticism factor. That if you're higher in the neuroticism factor, you're more likely to be in a -2 than a +2 as your default state. Though, of course, it's not simple. The experiences you've had, no doubt, make some of that, but some of it may just be innate.
Yeah.
And so I think that's important. But the memories, and so the memories that you have are really important to who you are. And the memories that you have, of course, are determined by your experiences. So having experiences that produce useful memories, and more good than bad memories, is a good thing. And so let's take this back to, again, game B. Think of school, sausage factory school, where teachers are always yelling at you and shaking your finger at you, etc.
Mhm.
That's going to produce a lot of bad memories for a young kid. Uh, Instead, you want a nurturing type thing that
Mhm.
does wag the finger occasionally when you do something really dangerous, bad, or stupid, but in
Mhm.
general is positive, so that most of your memories from young childhood are positive. And
Mhm.
you will be a different person if you have those two different kinds of nurturing experiences during your nurturing or anti-nurturing experiences during your educational period, just on the street as a kid, etc. And so managing that feeling of what it's like to be in the world towards a more positive valence, I believe, is hugely good.
Mhm. As we were speaking of hierarchical complexity and also the development across life through experience, um, Robert Keegan and the developmental hierarchy or the developmental stages came up for me, and what I find very interesting in this model is that um, the weak axis in this is time, which is to say that some people are lucky enough to have a density of experience across their life to reach all of the layers of that developmental hierarchy, and some people get stuck in a hamster wheel loop and never have the time to think and experience in order to aggregate the density of experience that is required to get you through that. And could it be a good measure for a game B kind of education system to help people move through the developmental hierarchy as quickly as possible to become fully expressed human beings?
That's a great idea, actually. And I will say first, my view on these hierarchies is that they're not exactly true, but they're useful. And so that I have read Kagan and some of the other ones, and just don't believe them as literally true, but as sort of pointers towards things that are important and worth considering. I think that's actually, though, a very interesting insight, and I'd go way beyond just education. I would go to life. When I talk to younger people in particular, many of them feel overwhelmed by just too much shit, right? Megan and I came up with the idea that TikTok was the last vacuum of attention. It sucks up all the unused attention that you could otherwise use for thinking and growing, and that has got to be a gigantic disservice to people that get stuck on that. As I often say in my podcast, parents, TikTok is worse than cigarettes. If I was you, I would not let my children deal with TikTok. And the reason is just the one you said. It sucks up their thinking time, even being bored. Bored is a prelude to breaking through to a next level oftentimes. And if you're always able to entertain yourself with some, mindless drip, a little dopamine drip, you're not going to have those experiences. So I would say, I really like this. This is a design feature of Game B, is that it needs to be enough time and effort in both K-12 education and adult life, particularly young adult life, say before you're 30, to get through developmental stages to be as fully realized of a human being as you're capable of being. And it probably varies considerably on people's ability to go through those levels. But I'm pretty sure most people can go a lot higher in those ranks than they currently are, particularly those who have allowed themselves to just be overwhelmed by all the Game A-ness. I mean, the Game A just wants to suck up all your attention into all this horse shit.
Yeah,
Very good insight.
because then if your attention is sucked up, then it's easier to have you stay in the game, to put it mildly. Much easier, right? It's easier to manipulate you, to exert propaganda that is effective, etc.
Absolutely. And in fact, that was my 1994 insight, that advertising was doing just that, right? That it was, manufacturing demand, it was channelizing our interests, it was defining our status games. I think that was sort of my proto understanding of the problem. Much richer now, but that was definitely part of it. And at that time, the main avenue was still TV. Online was very early. I was involved with it, but most people weren't. But TV was the real suck on people's souls of that era. And it was just about to become online. And online takes it to the next level because TV ads can't react to your behavior, while online ads and propaganda can. They know every move you make. They know more than you think they know. They even know what part of the screen you're looking at, oftentimes. Very important to break the outer programming to suck up our attention and time.
Now it's morphing into the next forum, run by AI, but essentially it's just getting stronger, but it's doing the same thing as it was doing back then. And that
AI
makes it.
most.
Sorry? No, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. I was
No,
going to
please
say,
go.
AI is right at the point of transition. So far, the big labs like OpenAI and Google and Anthropic have been, currently they've made some mistakes, but they've been relatively honorable in not turning their platforms into indoctrination machines. But it would be so easy to do so.
Mm-hmm.
And so particularly now that there are really good open source models from the Chinese mostly, and also Llama from Meta, the people who wrap things around the models are starting to do nasty shit. And you hear OpenAI saying, oops, we got to start competing more in a business sense. So they're going to be adding advertising, I'll bet you. And there'll be, product placement, oh, fuck, this is the enshittification that Cory Doctorow talks about. By the way, he'll be on my podcast in February. And this is, again, something that Game B, through its omni-consideration of what comes into being, should absolutely not allow, which is using AI to indoctrinate people. How we're going to stop that, I don't know. I've written in an essay, I haven't published yet, to publish it right after the first of the year, that I say, if I was Joseph Goebbels today, who was Hitler's truly brilliant propaganda minister, rather than using radio as my mechanism, I would be developing AI-based therapy tools, and I would be embedding my propaganda in them, because you're getting people at their most vulnerable. You can do it in very subtle ways that they don't even know, and you can program their values towards what you want. And the idea of that, and there are some of those that are being done in good faith today, and people tell me they help. I don't know, but it's such an obvious exploit to try to manipulate you at your most vulnerable, and there's no law against it. Perfectly legal for the Joseph Goebbels of 2026 to start Nazifying youth through subtle indoctrination in a supposed therapy. No law against that. Fucking mind boggle.
And which lands on the question, how can we use thinking machines to deepen and enhance our human thinking capacity? And
sound is breaking up here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are we back?
Try again.
Okay. Well, I was just saying it lands on the question of how can we use those thinking machines to enhance our human thinking, right? But maybe that's some meat for our next conversation, because we're running out of time, because we'll have somebody coming into this room in about 3 minutes. And we're running out of bandwidth, it seems to.
Yeah. And that'll be a topic we can talk about a lot. I've got many experiences and ideas on how AIs can be immensely helpful in our thinking.
Let's explore that.
They are also immensely dangerous if they're not properly positioned.